couple of housekeeping items before we get going this morning. So Wednesday night starts back the end of not the end of September. Starts back the end of January. I believe it's the 28th. 29th it is. I'm not the calendar person. So one of the courses that going to be offered this time, some of you who are, we've had conversation, I'm going to teach one about how to read and study the Bible. But given where we are in our adoption process, I might be a little bit delayed actually getting that started because we might not be here when we get started. So I wanted to go ahead and kind of get you familiar with the book that we're going to be looking at. For those of you who are thinking about joining in that class with me, this is called Bible Study That Works. It's written by a fellow named David L. Thompson. It's a short book. You can get it at Amazon. You can get it at Abe. I will not pass it around because it's my copy and you know how I am about my books. Here's what I will do is I'll get Laura to get the information and have that available. So maybe David can get it on the website to be available and she can put it out in the bulletin or have it available for you if you would like to order this book so you can prepare to join us in that class. So without further ado in that, my only housekeeping issue, some of you go, wait, you said you won't be here for because of adoption. We want to hear about that. And so, okay, I'll give you a little bit of an update from that. So Kelly and I will be shipping off next Saturday from Atlanta, flying to Bogota to finish the final leg of our adoption process. Thanks be to God, bureaucracy does work eventually. And the process eventually gets down to where you can actually travel, and so we'll be gone for at least 3 weeks. We'll covet your prayers for that. Jansen will still be in and around, and grandparents and aunts and uncles and church family helping her maintain some semblance of normalcy. So we'll be back and forth. I don't know if kind of how we can keep you updated, so we maybe post a few things on Facebook from time to time just to kind of keep you informed as we're away and as internet service allows. So we're certainly grateful for your prayers to this point, and we covet your prayers as we continue to travel and finish the last leg of our adoption journey there. So that's our news from the adoption front. And today I want to share with you basically one thing. So I have heroes of the faith just like you have heroes of the faith. And today, the content that we'll cover is not my content. I'm only a curator of the content. Right? Much like the songs we sing, no one here writes the songs every week that we sing in worship. And so I'm just alerting you today that very few of the words that here are mine. But they come from a hero of mine. And let me tell you a bit of a story about that hero. In 2012, I was a part of the Leadership Challenge in Marshall County, and we finished at the end of the Leadership Challenge. Most of the time you have a government day. Thanks be unto God, all people in the deal with what happens in local and state government. So we go to Montgomery, and we have this big reception at the end of government day, and you get to see all your state house representatives and the state senators, and the governor came through, and the whole nine. So I've been going on for this with the group for about 3 hours, glad handing in Montgomery, and I was still running my business and working for the church at the time. I just honestly, I got tired of talking to people. Really had. I was done being nice, and so I just dipped. I mean, ghosted on the whole party, right? And I took a walk down the street, and I went down to Dexter Avenue. Those of you are familiar with the Gump, Montgomery. The Gump is its affectionate name there in that part of the world. Those of you are familiar with it, Dexter Avenue is a dead-end street and goes right to the used to be the governor's mansion there. And on the right-hand side, the whole reason I went down Dexter Avenue was because I wanted to go see this little church that's up the way. There's a little bitty church that's about 1 block back from the dead end on Dexter Avenue. It's Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. And for those of you who are familiar with history will know that little bitty church was pastored by a young fellow once upon a time by the name of Martin Luther King. So I sat on the steps there, and it was dark, it's full moon night. It's one of those kind of romantic type things, you know. I sat on the steps, and I had one of those Jesus moments moments that he talks about in Luke chapter 4 when he comes into the synagogue and he says, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me. Right? Luke chapter 4, it comes from Isaiah. I've been sent to preach the good news to the poor, to proclaim the year that is acceptable, to release the captives, to give sight to the blind. You know, Jesus says all this stuff and everybody's looking at him. I had that same, or what I imagine to be a similar experience when I was sitting on the steps at Extra Avenue Baptist Church. And so, from that point forward, this young enterprising pastor, I didn't know too much about him, other than what history had taught me. I began to explore him some. So I give you that introduction to say that today's sermon does not belong to me, it belongs to a faith hero of mine by the name of Dr. Martin Luther King. And he actually preached this sermon in the Extra Avenue Baptist Church in 1951. And so I'm going to read much today, but if I have to, if you follow along and it gets a little bit passionate, friends, I pray that the Spirit of the Lord light on you in a similar way. Whatever way it is, whether you got to go sit on the steps at the Extra Avenue Baptist Church and be reminded that it is indeed what we are called to as Christians, not to be conformists, but be a transformed nonconformist, which is the title of today's sermon. As you see on the screen, it goes from Romans chapter 12 in the second verse, and it says, "Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may discern what is the will of God, what is the good and acceptable and perfect will of God." Do not be conformed is difficult advice in a generation where crowd pressures have unconsciously conditioned our minds and feet to move to the rhythmic drumbeat of the majority. Many voices force us and urge us to choose the path of least resistance and bid us to never fight for the unpopular cause that finds us in the pathetic minority of 2 or 3. In fact, even most of our intellectual disciplines nowadays persuade us for our need to conform. Some sociologists suggest that morality is merely groupthink and that the ways of old, friend, are the byways and the best ways. In fact, some psychologists say that the mental and emotional adjustment of life is the reward for thinking and acting like every other person in our life. Success, recognition, and conformity are the bywords of the modern world, where everyone seems to crave the anesthetizing security of being identified with the majority. So in spite of the prevailing tendency to conform, we as Christians have a mandate to be, underscore this, nonconformists. The Apostle Paul knew the inner realities of the Christian faith, counseled his early church and friends, do not be conformed to this world, but be you transformed by the renewing of your mind. We are called to be people of conviction, friends, as Christians, not people of conformity. We are called to moral nobility, not social respectability. And we are commanded to live differently, much well according to a different and higher loyalty. Every true Christian, friends, is a citizen of 2 worlds, the world that is right now and the world that is not yet. It is a paradox, you see. It's in the world that we live, and it's of the world we are not a part. To the Philippian Christians, Paul indeed later wrote, "We are a colony of heaven," for he understood, and they understood what he meant. For their city of Philippi was a Roman colony, where Romans wished to colonize an area. Here's what they would do. She would establish a small colony of people who lived by Roman law and by Roman ethics. And in another country, indeed, they would hold fast to their Roman allegiance. This powerful and creative minority spread the gospel of the Roman culture. And although the analogy may be imperfect, the apostle does point to the responsibility of we as Christians to imbue an unchristian world with the ideals of a higher and more noble order in which we live. As Christians, we must never surrender our ultimate and supreme loyalty to any time-bound custom or any earth-bound idea. For at the heart of our universe is the higher and ultimate reality. That reality is God and his kingdom of love. And it is that kingdom to which we must be conformed. Now, this command not to conform comes not just from the Apostle Paul, but from someone you're familiar with. His name is our Lord Jesus Christ, who is perhaps the most impressive nonconformist in history. And his nonconforming attitudes and tactics still confound the conscience of the human mind. When an affluent society, friends, begins to coax us into believing that happiness consists in the size of our home or the impressiveness of our house or our automobile, the expensiveness in our clothes, Jesus reminds us that it is not in a man's possessions which life is found. When we yield to the temptation of a world ripe with sexual immorality and gone wild with the hyper notion of self, Jesus tells us once again that whoever looks at a man or a woman with lust in their heart, though they have already committed adultery, he says. When we refuse to suffer for righteousness' sake and choose to follow the path that is comfort rather than conviction, Jesus reminds us once again, blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs shall be the kingdom of heaven. And when in our spiritual pride sometimes we boast of having reached the peak of moral excellence, Jesus warns that it's the tax collectors and the sinners that get into the kingdom of the heaven before somebody like me. And when through compassionless detachment and arrogant individualism we fail to respond to the needs of the underprivileged, the Master says, inasmuch as you've done it to the least of these, friends, you've done it to me as well. But when we allow the spark of revenge in our souls to flame up and hate toward our enemies to take over, Jesus teaches that we must love our enemies. We must bless them that curse us, do good to them that hate us, and pray for them which spitefully use us and persecute us. Everywhere and at all times, the love ethic of Jesus is a radiant light revealing the ugliness of our stale conformity. In spite of the imperative demand to live differently, we have cultivated a mass mind that moves toward the extreme of rugged individualism. We have no longer been able to become makers of history, except we are made by its history. Longfellow once said, in this world, a man must either be an anvil or a hammer, meaning that he is either a molder of society or molded by society. Who doubts that today most people are anvils and are shaped by the patterns of the majority? Or to change the figure a bit, most people, and we Christians sometimes in particular, have become more of the thermometers that record the temperature of the majority opinion, not the thermostat that transforms and regulates the temperature of society. Many people fear nothing more terribly than to take a position that stands out sharply and clearly from the prevailing opinion. The tendency of most is to adopt a view that is so ambiguous that it will include everything, and so popular that it will exclude not one person. Along with these is this grown inordinate worship nowadays of bigness. We live in an age where bigness is our byword. When we find security in that which is large and extensive, things like big cities, big buildings, big homes, big churches. We worship size that's caused many to have a fear of being identified with the minority opinion. And not a few of us who cherish lofty and noble ideas, we hide those ideas under a bushel basket for fear of being called different. Many sincere Americans privately oppose things like today immigration policy. But they're apprehensive about saying anything lest they be publicly condemned. Millions of citizens are deeply disturbed by the military-industrial complex too often shaping our national policy, but they do not want to be considered unpatriotic. A legion of thoughtful persons recognizes that traditional capitalism must continue to undergo change if our great national wealth is to be equitably distributed in a way that cares for all its citizens. Numerous decent and wholesome young people permit themselves to become involved in unwholesome pursuits, friends. which they do not personally condone or even enjoy, but because they're ashamed to say no when the gang says yes. How few people have the audacity to express publicly their convictions, and how many have allowed themselves to be astronomically intimidated. Thomas Jefferson once wrote that I have sworn upon the altar of God eternal hostility against everything and every form of tyranny over the mind of a man. To the conformist and the shaper of the conformist mentality, this must surely sound like the most dangerous and radical of doctrines. Have we permitted the lamp of individual thought and individualism to become so dim that were Jefferson to write and live in today's words, he would find it to be something that he would be harassed and investigated for saying such out loud? Nowhere is the tragic tendency for us to conform more evident than in the church, an institution which has often served to crystallize, conserve, and even bless the patterns of majority opinion. The erstwhile sanctions of the church for things such as slavery, segregation, war, economic exploitation is simply a testimony to the fact that the church has at times hearkened more to the authority of the world than to the authority of God. Called to be moral guardians of our community, the church at times has preserved that which is immoral and unethical. Called to combat social evils, it has remained silent behind stained glass windows. Called to lead men on the highway of community and brotherhood and to summon them to rise above the narrow confines of bigotry, it has enunciated and practiced exclusiveness. Well, now he starts to meddle because he reminds us that we preachers have also been tempted to be enticed into this culture of conformity. Seduced by the success symbols of the world, we preachers oftentimes have measured our achievements by the size of our congregation. We have become showy to please the whims and caprices of all people. We preach comforting sermons to avoid saying anything from the pulpit that might have the sniff of disturbing the respectable people in our pews. Have we ministers of Jesus Christ sacrificed truth on the altar of self-interest and, like Pilate, yielded our convictions to the demands of the crowd? We need to recapture a gospel glow of the early Christians where they were, by in fact definition, nonconformist in the truest sense of the word and refused to shape their witness according to the mundane patterns of the world. Willingly they sacrificed fame, fortune, and life itself in behalf of a cause they knew to be right. Qualitatively, they were small in number, but quality-wise, they were gigantic. Their powerful gospel put an end to such barbaric evils as infanticide and gladiatorial contest. Finally, friends, they even captured the entire Roman Empire for the cause of Jesus Christ. Gradually, however, the church became so entrenched in its wealth and prestige that she began to dilute the strong demands of the gospel and to conform to the ways of the world. And ever since, the church has been a weak and ineffectual trumpet making uncertain sounds in this world. For friends, in fact, if the Church of Jesus Christ is to regain her strength and power and message and authentic reign, we must conform only to the demands of the gospel. The hope of a secure and livable world with disciplined nonconformists is where it lies, where we are dedicated to justice, to peace, and to community and brotherhood. The trailblazers in human and academic and scientific and religious freedom have always been nonconformists. In any cause that concerns the progress of mankind, put your faith in the nonconformist, friends. In his essay on self-reliance, Emerson wrote, "Whoso would be a man must be a nonconformist." The Apostle Paul reminds us that whoso would be a Christian, friends, must also be a nonconformist. Any Christian who blindly accepts the opinions of the majority in fear and timidity follows a path of expediency and social approval that turns you into a mental and spiritual slave. Mark well these words from the pen of James Russell Lowell. They are slaves who fear to speak for the fallen and the weak. They are slaves who will not choose hatred, scoffing, and abuse, rather than in silence shrink from the truth, who needs must think. They are slaves who dare not be right, even in the presence of just 2 or 3. Nonconformity itself, however, will not necessarily be good and may at times possess neither transforming nor redemptive power. Nonconformity in and of itself contains no saving value and may represent in some circumstances little more than the form of exhibitionism. Paul in his the latter half of this text gives us a constructive formula for nonconformity. Be transformed by the renewing of your minds. Nonconformity, friends, is created when it's controlled and directed by the transformed life, the disciplined spiritual life, and it is constructive when it is embracing a new mental outlook. By opening our lives to God in Christ, we become new creatures. This experience in which Jesus talked about is what he referred to as the new birth. And it is essential if we are to be transformed nonconformists and freed from the cold-heartedness and self-justification so often characteristic of nonconformity. Someone has said, I think it was me, I love reforms, but I hate reformers. A reformer may be an untransformed nonconformist whose rebellion against the evils of society has just left him annoyingly rigid and unreasonably impatient. Only through an inner spiritual transformation do we gain the strength to fight vigorously the evils of the world in which we are called in humble service and a loving spirit. The transformed nonconformist, moreover, never wields to the passive sort of patience which is an excuse to do nothing. And this very transformation saves him or her from speaking irresponsible words which estrange without reconciling, and from making hasty judgments which are blind to the necessity of progress. We recognize that social change will not come overnight, yet we work as though it is imminently possible. This hour in our history needs a dedicated circle of transformed nonconformists, friend. Our planet teeters on the brink of climatological annihilation. Dangerous passions of pride, hatred, and selfishness are enthroned in even our own lives inside the church. Truth lies prostrate on the rugged hills of some nameless Calvary, and men do reverence before false gods of things like nationalism, consumerism, and materialism. The saving of our world from its pending doom will come not through the complacent adjustment of conforming majority, but through the creative maladjustment of a non-conforming minority. Some years ago, I was reminded of the dangers of overstressing the well-adjusted life, the normal life, you and I might call it. Everyone's passionate about seeking the normal and well-adjusted life. I am. I'm sure you are too. But we must, of course, be well-adjusted if we are to avoid things like neuroticism and schizoid personalities. But those are just some of the things that our world, in which men's goodwill there are some things in this world in which we must not be adjusted to. I confess that I've never intended to become adjusted to the evils of abuse and the crippling effects of discrimination, to the moral degeneracy of religious bigotry, or the corroding effects of narrow sectarianism, to economic conditions that deprive people of work and food, and to the insanities of materialism. Human salvation lies in the hands of the creatively maladjusted. Human salvation lies in the hands of the creatively maladjusted. Now, all this time I've been telling you that it was okay not to be okay. He's supporting our claim here. Human salvation lies in the hands of the creatively maladjusted. We need today, friends, the maladjusted people to be like Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego, who, when ordered by King Nebuchadnezzar to bow down before the golden image, said in unequivocal terms, "If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us, O king, but if not, we will not serve your God." Like Thomas Jefferson, we need those to be adjusted in an age of slavery who wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all people are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among those are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness," like Abraham Lincoln, who saw that a house divided could not stand, being half slave and half free. The supremely like our Lord, who in the midst of an intricate and fascinating military machine known as the Roman Empire, looked at his disciples and said, "Those who live by the sword shall also die by the sword." Christianity has always been thus. And in fact, friends, it is through this same such maladjustment that an already decadent generation is called to do things which will bring about peace on this earth. Now, honestly, I'm compelled to admit that being a transformed nonconformist, which is always costly and never altogether comfortable, may mean walking through the valley of the shadow of suffering and death. It may mean losing your job. It may mean having your 6-year-old daughter look at you and ask, "Daddy, why is it that you have to spend so much time in jail?" But we are gravely mistaken to think, and I don't want you to miss any other line this morning, we are gravely mistaken to think that Christianity protects us from the pain and agony of mortal existence. Christianity has always insisted that the cross you bear precedes the crown you wear. Christianity has always insisted that the cross we bear precedes the crown we wear. To be a Christian, one must take up your cross with all its difficulties and agonizing and tragedy-packed content and carry it until it leaves a mark across your back, the mark of redemption that is the most excellent way, which comes only through the sufferings brought to this world by Christ. In these days of worldwide confusion, there is a dire need for men and women who will be courageously doing battle for the truth, friends. We need Christians who will echo the words of those that we have already spoken and will not refuse not to preach the good news of the gospel simply because of its difficulty that comes with it in society. We must make a choice. Will we continue to march to the drumbeat of conformity and respectability, or will we listen to the beat of a more distant drum, moving to its echoing sounds? Will we march only to the music of time, or will we risk criticism and abuse? Marching to the soul-saving music of eternity. More than ever before, friends, today we are challenged by the words of yesterday. Do not be conformed to the image of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind.